Ambassador, there are efforts underway to try and resolve this diplomatically, politically, a political solution of some kind. There are talks that have been taking place in Oman. What is the U.S. trying to do to get to a political solution?
Well, I think we're going to try very hard, as I understand it, to get behind Martin Griffiths, the new special envoy for Yemen at the United Nations. And we just saw a bit of the clip from Guterres about that subject. And I think it's an important opportunity because I do think that he has been very active so far. He's been in the region, he's been talking to the parties to the conflict. And I think this is an opportunity. We need to seize it, however, that we can't let this go. And one of the obstacles to this whole business right now is the resolution 2216, which is now over almost 3 years old, and it's terribly outdated and really has created conditions that are obstacles to achieving peace, such as it demands the Houthis to completely capitulate in advance of any peace agreement. It really insists on the restoration of President Hadi himself into the presidency. And I don't think anyone believes that's going to be the case in the future. So I do think that we need to see what the conditions are and what the elements are that are going to allow Mr. Griffiths and the parties to come to a political settlement of this war. Because again, as Sanaa just said, there's only one way out of this, and that is through a negotiation and through some kind of a peace process.
Right. The UN envoy, Old Sheikh Ahmed, said in a statement that a peace agreement, including a well-articulated security plan and the formation of an inclusive government, is the only way to end the war. Is there support for that?
Well, I think realistically there's got to be support for that, but it depends on who you ask at the moment. I think everyone's going to say yes, of course, right. But then you're going to say, well, who are you going to bring into the tent? And I think we need to see that we bring the southern separatists in, for example. We need to bring in the Islahis, the Muslim Brotherhood element in the political process. And of course, all of the other elements in Yemen, as I said, this is a multipolar conflict now. So no one can be excluded because they will be spoilers. And they will do their best to destroy whatever process is being constructed by the United Nations and the international community.
Sanaa, how do you see this? Is there going to be a place for the Houthis in the government in some kind of solution?
I mean, it's really hard because at the moment, nobody wants to come to the table and talk peace. Everybody thinks that they can still win this militarily, which realistically, when you look at how long this war has taken, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the situation. But I think the problem is everybody wants a specific outcome. They already know how they want Yemen to look in the future, so they're not really willing to negotiate something that would benefit everyone. And I think right now, the new UN envoy to Yemen, he's newly appointed. He hasn't really done anything because he's studying and he's expanding the negotiations out. But I really think that there's a lot of weight on his shoulder. A lot of Yemenis and a lot of the international community is trusting that this person can bring a different result. This is the third UN envoy to try and mitigate some sort of peace in Yemen. And so as you can tell, it's really difficult. But based on his previous work experience, he's going to have a lot on his plate. Personally speaking, though, I think that there are people in Yemen and outside of Yemen, who don't want specific parties to be involved. There are some that refuse to engage in any kind of peace process if the result means that President Hadi will be in place, or if the result means that there will be Houthis in place. And I think that's not very realistic. Because, when you negotiate, you're not negotiating with friends, you're negotiating with enemies, and you have to kind of compromise. And that's the one thing that I think people in this conflict are not realizing. They have to accept things that they don't necessarily want for the sake of peace.
All right, Fahad, what is the Saudi position in this? Because part of that plan actually calls for President Hadi's powers to be reduced. Then there will be a newly appointed vice president who will take on many of those powers, set up an interim government, and then leading to an election. Is that something that Saudi Arabia can live with?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, whatever resolution is reached has to be reached between the warring parties in Yemen. It has to be between the parties that began this conflict, the Houthis and their opponents. So this is a decision that Yemen has to make. But I think a broader point here has to be stressed. And so when we look at the Houthis, it's become very clear, I think, to the entire international community, with the exception of Iran, perhaps, which seems to be very fond of the Houthis and continues to supply them with missile parts and technology. But the Houthis are very clearly a militant non-state actor that feels that it can operate outside the norms, outside the parameters of the international relations norms and conventions. And this really has come at the detriment of the people of Yemen. That's why they're using child soldiers. That's why they keep using mines, which overwhelmingly affects children again. That's why they've used food and medicine as weapons of war. They just don't believe in using what are basically the foundations of how international relations are conducted. And frankly, this is with the support of Iran. Iran has a long history of supporting groups like that operate outside the norms. And it just creates for instability certainly for those countries involved, but instability for the wider region and the wider international community.
I want to go back to Radhya and talk about the humanitarian situation, particularly in the situation regarding children. We just heard Fahad tell us there, Radhya, that food and medicine are being used as weapons here. How difficult is it for the flow of aid to get to people in need in Yemen right now?
The problem in Yemen now is that source of income has vanished. So many people, they don't have the source of income. And for those who have a source of income, some source of income, they can't find the appropriate medical treatment. And even if they want to travel outside Yemen, they can't because, you know, Sanaa airport is closed, and for many families, it's very difficult to travel for many hours. In the beginning, that UN said that 22 million people are in need of kind of protection, or this is almost all of us. We are about 30 million. So if this war just continue by 2018 and 2019, humanitarian NGOs will have to feed each person in Yemen, and this is impossible. All the efforts are taking place now are good, but they're just filling the gaps. But the war should stop if we want this. People to start their life again. Now we are dying more than we are living, and I think that peace is still very possible in Yemen. There is a balance of weakness between all parties to the conflict in Yemen because they all don't have a project. They don't know what they are fighting, and they have a very heavy file of violations, and they are all tired, and they can be pushed to the table. And I agree with the idea that no one should be excluded, even if they are all criminals. But this is the situation. We don't know what to do. They should be all in the table, and they should agree to rebuild the state, and this is not impossible. It needs just a political will from not the Yemeni groups, but also from the Saudi and Emirati and the international community.
Ambassador, getting back to something you said earlier, that this is a regional war, and there are many commentators and analysts who believe that what we're seeing in Yemen is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So given that, how important is it that Iran be brought into any future settlement?
I think it's essential that Iran understand that it has a responsibility now, because it does work very closely with the Houthis. It's had a long relationship with the community of the Zaydi Shia in Yemen. So I think that it would be deluding ourselves to think we can come to a deal without the support of all of the players in the region, and Iran is one of them. And they do have influence with the Houthis, and they can exercise the influence, I think, effectively, as others can as well. But I do think the Saudis need to understand that they cannot win this militarily. This is now, after 3 years, over 16,000 airstrikes over the poorest country in the Arab world, and to what end? Really only the destruction of Yemen and the suffering of the population. They're no closer to achieving their objectives now than they were over 3 years ago.
Sam, there's one criticism that we've heard, and that is that this has been called the forgotten war. It's not on the radar anymore.
Yeah.
How does one change that?
It's really difficult. I think in the United States specifically, I put the weight on the Senate right now and on Congress, because that's where they're discussing Yemen. That's where the subject keeps coming up. I think with an administration here in the US that's a little bit chaotic, it's hard to kind of forget Yemen. It's a 5-minute news segment, and then it's forgotten to another current event. And I think internationally, unfortunately, there are other catastrophes happening in the region. Just a few days ago, we were all talking about Syria, and we still are, about the chemical attacks and the possibility of American involvement there. And I think that just the nature of how the world is today, it goes to where the most pressing issue is. I think the problem with Yemen is that there's no actual international coverage from the ground. And I think that that would really help and benefit Yemenis and the international community in knowing exactly what goes on inside of Yemen. Yemen right now is kind of like a closed tuna can waiting to burst. Yemenis are not allowed to leave outside of Yemen. It's really difficult to get visas. They're not really going as immigrants anywhere. And the ones who live in Saudi Arabia, for many, many years, a lot of them, thousands of them, are being kicked back into Yemen during the war, which is suffocating Yemen as it is. And I think just having credible and reliable international journalists there could really bring better understanding to the world of what goes on inside of Yemen. But it falls on the shoulders of people like you and people like us to speak about it.
Okay, I want to get a final word from Radhya in Sanaa. Radhya, we heard from the United Nations Secretary General at the beginning of the show. He was telling us that Yemen is a priority for the UN. He would like to see a solution there. He's appointed a new special envoy. Are you optimistic that these steps, these measures that are being taken can work, that there could soon be peace in the country?
Yes, I'm very optimistic. And I'm optimistic also by the new special envoy. He seems to be direct, and I'm sure if he just worked hard, he can do some influence. In Yemen, whenever there is an effort, there is a result. And I want to just say that the war in Yemen is not forgotten. It is just ignored. Arms trade are in the way of the war in Yemen and many financial and political interests. But I still think that any serious war can just go over all of this, and peace process can just go successfully.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.